My name is Ethan. 12 months ago, my mother took her last breath right in my arms at 2 a.m. while my entire body shook with terror. Before her heart stopped, she looked into my eyes and blamed me for ruining her life. My greedy uncle stood in the shadows, smiling as he prepared to steal her entire estate. They thought I was a broken, naive boy who would inherit nothing but guilt. They were entirely wrong. Watch what happens next. To understand how I ended up on that bedroom floor, you have to look at the 2 weeks leading up to that horrific night. My mother, Diana, had been feeling incredibly unwell. Her health was fluctuating wildly. One day she seemed completely fine, and the next she could barely move. Because I was working full-time to pay our mounting bills, I couldn't accompany her to her first routine doctor's appointment. It didn't seem serious at the time. When I asked her how the appointment went, she brushed it off and even deleted the text reply she had started typing. She claimed she was taking her medication, but she kept secretly delaying her crucial lab work. I felt a deep sense of unease growing in my chest, but I trusted her. She was an adult, and she had always managed her own life. I had no idea that my Uncle Richard was already whispering poison into her ears. By the next Thursday, her condition worsened significantly. I finally stepped in, called the laboratory myself, and forced them to come out to our house for testing. When the results arrived, my heart dropped. The reports showed she had severe, unmanaged diabetes. She was too heavy to move easily and was completely refusing to even walk to the bathroom or drink water. Panic set in, and I immediately called her family for help. I called my mother's brother, Uncle Richard, and his son, Caleb. Caleb claimed to have medical knowledge, though he wasn't an actual doctor. Instead of telling me to rush her to the emergency room, Richard explicitly told me to avoid the hospital. He said a private house visit doctor would be much safer and calmer for her. Because my mother always fiercely hated hospitals and surgeries, I naively agreed to his suggestion. I spent hours calling 4 different hospitals until I finally found a licensed doctor who accepted house visits. When she arrived, she measured my mother's oxygen, blood sugar, and pressure. She reassured us that everything would be completely fine, gave her an 4 drip, and left a detailed nutrition plan. For a brief moment, I felt an overwhelming wave of relief. Everything finally seemed great. But exactly 8 hours later, the nightmare returned with a vengeance. My mother started feeling drastically worse. I wanted to call an ambulance right then, but I was completely freaking out inside. On the outside, I looked perfectly calm, but my mind was spinning in total terror. My mother kept crying out that she hated hospitals and was convinced she would die if she went to an ER. I called Uncle Richard again late that night, completely desperate for guidance. He calmed me down over the phone and told me to let her sleep. He said, "Ethan, don't stress her out with an ambulance. I am planning on taking her to the specialized clinic myself first thing in the morning." Trusting my own flesh and blood, I finally closed my eyes and went to sleep. That was the biggest mistake of my life. At 2 a.m., a strange noise woke me up. My mother was trying to force herself to go to the bathroom but couldn't get herself up. I rushed over and carried her in my arms. Suddenly, something inside her body collapsed. She began gasping for air, looking at me with a terrifying mixture of anger and absolute pain. Right before the ambulance finally arrived, it was already too late. She died right there in my arms. In her final moments, she unleashed a wave of deeply hurtful words that made me completely hate myself. She claimed that God hated me, that she was leaving to punish me, and blamed me entirely for not quitting my job to care for her. She compared me harshly to a co-worker who took days off for their mother. I was completely crushed by the guilt, stuck inside a dark reality that I utterly hated. The very next morning, before my mother's body was even properly prepared for the funeral, Uncle Richard and Cousin Caleb marched into our living room. They didn't shed a single tear. Instead, Richard pointed a finger at me in front of the remaining neighbors and shouted, "This is entirely your fault, Ethan. You neglected your own mother for your petty job and let her die in this house." The neighbors gasped, and I stood there completely frozen, drowning in my own massive pool of grief and shame. Richard then pulled out a document, claiming that because of my gross negligence, my mother had signed over her entire estate, including our family house and her massive savings account, to him just 3 days prior. He told me I had exactly 1 week to pack my bags and get out. I moved into a tiny, damp basement apartment, completely lonely and broken. Everyone around me wanted what was good for themselves, and nobody cared about my pain at all. I lost lots of money, my home, and my mind. For 2 solid months, I cried myself to sleep, believing I was truly the monster who killed his own mother. But truth has a beautiful way of finding its way out of the darkest shadows. While packing my final box of old books from my mother's room, I found her old iPad that synced directly with her phone. I decided to charge it, hoping to find some old pictures to comfort my grieving heart. When the screen lit up, I clicked on her deleted messages folder. What I found inside made the blood in my veins completely turn to ice. My sadness instantly evaporated into pure, burning rage. There were dozens of text messages and secret audio notes from Uncle Richard and Caleb sent during those final 2 weeks. In one audio file, Richard explicitly told my mother, "Diana, don't take the diabetes meds Ethan bought you. It's poison. Ethan is secretly trying to get rid of you so he can take your money and quit his job." They had intentionally manipulated her declining mind. The messages showed a calculated, sinister plot. Caleb, using his fake medical authority, had been text messaging her terrible, incorrect medical advice behind my back. They actively convinced her to hide her real symptoms from me, to reject beneficial food, and to skip her hospital appointments. They purposely manufactured her anger toward me so she would sign that new estate will. The final piece of evidence was a recorded phone call between Richard and Caleb on the night she died. Richard could be heard laughing, saying, "Ethan is panicking and wants to call an ambulance. I told him to let her sleep. By tomorrow morning, she'll be gone, the kid will blame himself forever, and the house is legally ours." They had deliberately let my mother die for a piece of real estate. My hands shook, but not from fear this time. I realized I wasn't the culprit, I was the victim of a deeply evil trap. I didn't storm over to her old house to yell at them. Instead, I took the iPad straight to a high-profile criminal defense attorney and filed a massive lawsuit for fraud, undue influence, and involuntary manslaughter through deliberate medical sabotage. When Uncle Richard received the court summons, he laughed it off, assuming a broke, grieving kid couldn't possibly fight his legal team. But during the very first preliminary hearing, my attorney submitted the fully forensic data, the text logs, and the explicit audio recordings directly to the judge. The courtroom fell into a dead, horrified silence as Richard's own laughing voice echoed through the speakers. The judge's face turned bright red with absolute fury. He immediately threw out the fraudulent will, froze every single one of Richard's bank accounts, and ordered a full criminal investigation into both Richard and Caleb for elder abuse and corporate fraud. Richard's expensive lawyers literally packed up their briefcases and walked out of the room, refusing to defend him anymore. The legal battle was swift and completely devastating for them. The state court awarded me full possession of my mother's estate, plus massive financial damages that wiped out Richard's personal savings entirely. Because of the criminal charges of deliberate medical sabotage and forgery, Uncle Richard and his son Caleb were sentenced to federal prison. They lost absolutely everything. True justice doesn't just clear your name, it completely dismantles the people who tried to destroy you. I moved back into my mother's house, but I completely remodeled it to clear out the dark memories. I used a portion of the inherited money to set up a local charity foundation in her name, dedicated to protecting vulnerable elders from financial abuse by greedy relatives. I still miss my mother deeply, and I wish I could tell her the truth about what happened. But I no longer carry the heavy, suffocating guilt that almost took my life. I look at the empty chairs in my living room and know that the monsters who caused our family's pain are finally paying for their sins behind cold steel bars. I kept my silent promise to her. Comment below what you would have done if your own flesh and blood tried to frame you for your mother's passing just to steal her money. Would you have checked her devices, or would you have let them win out of pure grief because this community knows that tracking the receipts is the only way to survive? Thank you for listening to Ethan's journey of absolute truth. Remember, this dramatic story is inspired by real forum entries but heavily adapted for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. If you take one lesson from Ethan's story, let it be this: never let toxic people project their malice onto your heart. Protect your boundaries, check the digital footprints, and always fight for the absolute truth. Sleep well tonight.